Hello, welcome back to the Death in Literature YouTube video series. I'm Dr. William Lee, a historian, not a scholar of literature, just a lifelong enthusiast. And there was a good response. This is the second video. There was a very good response to the first video, so I thank you, all of you who watched that one. I was very pleased, and now here I am doing a second one the day after the first, which is perhaps a bit too soon. I don't want to overwhelm you with videos, but I had such a good time yesterday that I couldn't resist, and in particular doing the second and final of my Thomas Mann, Death in Thomas Mann videos. So yesterday we did the Magic Mountain. Today we have three works: Joseph and His Brothers, Death in Venice, and Dr. Faustus. And that will be it for Thomas Mann, at least for now. I realized today that I hadn't included Buddenbrooks, which was probably really Thomas Mann's most famous novel in his homeland, in Germany, a revered and beloved novel to this day. And I do remember an interesting death in Buddenbrooks, but I don't remember it so well that I could recount it to you. And so it doesn't stand out in my mind as much as the other ones from Thomas Mann, but it's been so long since I've read that book, and I need to take another look at it. Okay, so question to start with today. Do Germans handle death differently from Russians, from British people, French people, Americans, etc., etc.? You know, I've never asked myself that before, but looking at literature would certainly be a good way to find out something about that. So I've got to start thinking about that as I go through these. I think, yeah, I don't know. I mean, Americans, I'm American. I'm doing this from the United States. Despite my Swiss hat, I spend a few months a year in Switzerland. Yeah, Americans tend to be more wanting to not confront death directly. You know, watch Westerns, watch horror movies, that sort of thing. You know, Americans love horror movies. And yet not really confront it head on in all what is sometimes its ugliness. So go figure. I think Germans are more sort of in tune with that. Not that they're sympathetic or morbid, but it's sort of got a big place in the culture, and it had a big place in the culture before the Second World War, and obviously after the Second World War. All of the books that we're looking at today are, well, no. Yes, all of the books that we're looking at today are, I think, 20th century works. I'm not sure about Death in Venice, but it must be. Yeah, anyway, so that's a question for me to think about, for you to think about if you're interested. How do different cultures approach death as indicated by literature specifically? Okay, and we can also talk about different kinds of death, not in the sense of, here's a death from illness, here's a death from suicide, but where do we put the agency? You know, is it fate? Is it God? Is it nature? Is it random? Those are the ones I listed, and in different books, sometimes even by the same author, you're going to find different approaches to that. And that's another thing I want to bear in mind as I go through these. And does it have a moral aspect? Yeah, sometimes yes, in some of these works, sometimes very strongly, other times no. It is more in the nature of being, you know, the universe is playing a joke on the person who actually dies. One interesting thing that comes into one of the books this evening is the idea of animal substitution. And, I spoke rather disparagingly and rather bitterly even about my experience as a child with the book Where the Red Fern Grows. And today my vitriol is directed at this cliche, not so much in novels as in movies, where you start out with the death of an animal that is usually in quite a cruel way, with the animal suffering, which is supposed to symbolize the I don't know, the ill luck or the mortality or the suffering, usually of the protagonist. And to me, it's always a concession to weakness on the part of the writers. You're using this cliche that you see over and over and over again in movies, and I put it on the same level as having everything burned down at the end. You don't know how to end the film, so you just have everything burned down. And you don't know how to unfold the vulnerability of the protagonist or another character, so you have this just really obvious symbol of the animal who suffers and dies. And I just don't like that. I love animals, and I also think, it's weak. It's weak. Let's move on from cliches like that. But the example we have today in Thomas Mann is anything but that, and it may in fact be my number one pick for the most the biggest impression made on me by any death in literature. Okay, so let's start actually with Death in Venice. It was a book that preceded The Magic Mountain. It was after Buddenbrooks, I believe, but it preceded The Magic Mountain. And in fact, The Magic Mountain was supposed to be a sort of, not continuation, because in a completely different setting, but it was supposed to be directly related thematically to Death in Venice. So the main character in Death in Venice, Gustav von Aschenbach, is an older man. I mean, he's middle-aged, he's not elderly, but he is confronting not so much his own mortality as the idea of getting older and losing sort of the beauty of youth. We don't know that he was necessarily a handsome young man, but yeah, I mean, this whole idea of losing the vitality and beauty of youth is, that's one of the reasons why he fixates on this 13-year-old boy. It's also very creepy, but the way he fixates on this 13-year-old boy. But, you can shrug your shoulders and say, all Thomas Mann means by this is that he sees this absolutely perfect, beautiful specimen of, the godlike youth. And he's leaving all that behind. So, getting to the topic of death, well, it's right there in the title. So we're mostly dealing with disease today in the deaths in these three works, and Aschenbach dies of cholera. It is going around, so to speak. It's present in Venice at that time, and he should leave. Other people are leaving, but he doesn't want to leave because Tadzio is still there, the godlike youth. And so he ends up succumbing to cholera, and it's a very jarring scene because there he is at the end on the beach, sitting in his beach chair and dead. And it looks like he's still alive. It takes people a while to figure out that he actually has passed away. So that's kind of a gruesome example of a death in literature. And does it have a moral component? Well, yeah, I mean, certainly it was a failure on Aschenbach's part to work through this problem that he was having. So you could say that there's a moral component to it. The only other death by cholera, I think, that I've come across in literature is in a children's book, The Secret Garden, where there's this great gripping scene. The little girl who will be the protagonist of the book, her parents are killed within a 24-hour period by cholera. And it's a chilling scene, but it's not sort of sadistic and wallowing in death the way I took the death theme in Where the Red Fern Grows to be. And it just didn't have that kind of impact on me as a child. I thought, ooh, this is really gruesome and interesting, but it didn't give me an existential crisis, and I think that's a good thing. I don't think kids should have existential crises if they can avoid it. Okay, so the next work is Dr. Faustus, and that is a novel that I believe came after Joseph and His Brothers. No, Felix Kroll was Thomas Mann's last. And actually, I'm not sure which came first between Dr. Faustus and Joseph and His Brothers, but Dr. Faustus is really a reaction to fascism and Nazism in Germany. And the main character is a musician, Adrian Leverkuhn, and as you can see by the title, he makes a deal with the devil, so to speak, and he ends up dying of syphilis. So we've had cholera, now we have syphilis. And before he dies, about 10 years, I believe, before he dies, he loses his mind. And so this is a form of death that I think we all dread, probably more than others. It's not syphilis nowadays so much as Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia. And there's definitely a moral component this time, this whole deal with the devil and the payment that has to be made. It's a dark book. It makes me think of the way Nietzsche died, also of syphilis, and also just losing his mind at the end. And I think most of us would prefer not to even continue our lives under those circumstances. But, I'm not making value judgment about that. Okay, and now we come to the main event, which is Joseph and His Brothers. And I have, there's more than the deaths that I'm relating here, but I happen to be rereading. It's a tetralogy. It's really 4 volumes or 4 novels, and I happen to be rereading them at the moment. And so it's very much on my mind. So this is the story of the biblical Joseph. It's a novel, of course, but Thomas Mann did tons and tons of research. I've heard it said that he stole other people's research, but even if that's true, he still had to do, tons of research himself, and it's just an utterly fascinating book and just a work of genius. Even more than the Magic Mountain, it's a work of genius. People tend to not go there because it's 4 volumes and it's full, like the Magic Mountain, but even more so, of philosophy and theology and all kinds of things like that. But it also has this very compelling story, and it's built around the biblical account of Joseph and his brothers in the book of Genesis in the Bible. And so the first death that stands out to me is the death of Rachel, Joseph's mother. So she dies in childbirth. All of our births today, Freudian slip, all of our deaths today are basically of natural causes. She dies in childbirth, and she is in absolute agony before she dies, giving birth to a son that she can't really, according to the novel, she's not built for childbearing. She had great trouble giving birth to Joseph, and now giving birth to his younger brother, Benjamin, who survives the birth. Rachel does not survive the birth. And I think any man reading this will have a new dimension of appreciation for what women went through historically and still go through in some instances where, they know they might not survive and they're in absolute agony. And Rachel realizes at some point that she is in fact going to die, although her husband is telling her no, he doesn't want to let her go. And it's just grueling. But it is not grotesque or sadistic. It's very, very well done. I've never come across another account, fictional or non-fictional, of death in childbirth that's on the level of this one. Okay, so the next one, and here's the one that I put number one on my list of deaths in literature. All not just Thomas Mann, but all of the works that I've read. So that's really saying something, and that's the death of Isaac, the patriarch Isaac. Again, in the book of Genesis, he is the son of Abraham, the founder of the Jewish faith and of monotheism. And he is the boy who almost met a nasty end as a child because, in the biblical account, very controversial, but there it is, God commands Abraham to take his just dearly beloved son, Isaac, who sounds like he's an adolescent, maybe 12 or 13, to take him out to I don't know where, outside of the settlement, and sacrifice him. Lay him on an altar and sacrifice him, slit his throat, and let his blood flow and be the sacrifice. And then Abraham says, okay, I'll do it. What God says, I'll do. And so there he goes, and he has the boy bound and on the altar, and the boy has realized what's going on. But God then sends a ram to be sacrificed in place of Isaac. You know, I've heard different theories about this. One being that this marks the point in ancient history with the Hebrews, the tribe at that time, when human sacrifice ended. And maybe that's true. You know, human sacrifice was rife throughout that whole area, as indeed it was in other parts of the world. I think in most parts of the world. But that this marked the end of it. I don't know if that's true or not, but what happens in the novel, in Joseph and his brothers, is that Isaac's two sons, Jacob and Esau, come to see him on his deathbed. They've made a truce with themselves. At one time they were deadly enemies, but now they've made a truce, and they come to their father's deathbed. And what happens, I can barely describe this scene, it's so chilling, is that while they watch, while they're attending upon their father with other members of his household, he starts to turn into the sacrificial ram. His face starts to take on these sort of goat-like features or sheep-like features, and his voice becomes a bleat, and they are horrified, but they also realize that they are in the presence of something divine, and they sort of fall down on the ground. All of the people who are attending on the deathbed, because it's just so uncanny. It's just so overwhelming. And why is this important? That's what's hard to describe. I think when I tell people a lot of times that this is really my highest example of death in literature, they think, you know, I don't even like that scene. What are you talking about? But the idea is that before human beings worshipped gods, let alone becoming monotheistic, the most primordial, back at a time when human beings were animals themselves, were just beginning to separate themselves from the animals, was this just primitive primordial animal god, in this case a goat god. And the goat is still looked upon as this very sinister symbol. You know, it's a satanic symbol, and so on and so forth. And you know, that's not to say that this is supposed to tell them that that there's anything satanic. Satan doesn't come into it. Evil doesn't come into this scene. It's the idea that behind religion there is this just so powerful primordial force. And you see that coming through in Isaac. And there are other aspects of it too, as well, but I would be talking all night. And so you still see that sometimes with some very charismatic artists and leaders, and, you know, this sort of whole rock star thing, that they are able to, the people who come to their rallies or to their concerts or what have you, they're able to channel this sort of dark primordial animal god that goes back beyond human history and beyond, almost beyond human memory. And so it's a very, very powerful scene. And I've never come across anything like it, and it's the absolute opposite of this sort of weak cliche of the animal substitution, symbolic animal substitution for a protagonist who's suffering and whom life treats cruelly. Okay. Although the death itself is very naturalistic in the sense that Isaac dies of old age, very, very old age, I should add, biblical old age. Okay, so the next and final one is the death of Montkaw. Montkaw spelled Mont-Kaw. He is not in the Bible, unlike the other characters. He's not in the biblical account, but Joseph, when he's taken down to Egypt, when he's sold by his brothers to traders who take him down to Egypt and sell him as a slave to the household of Potiphar, and he becomes Potiphar's steward and has charge of the entire household and everything that Potiphar owns. But in this version, he's only 17 when he goes down to Egypt, and there's already a steward, a man who is dying slowly of kidney disease, and his name is Montkaw. He is Joseph. He looks at Joseph, and rather like Isaac's children look at their father and see that goat god, Montkaw looks at Joseph and sees a god. He sees not that Joseph is a god, but that he is a god bearer. Let's put it that way. And so he knows at once that this is a special individual. And certainly Joseph lives up to that. And so Montkaw eventually does succumb to his kidney failure. He's a good man. He's the epitome of what you would find and designate in literature a good man. And he is unselfish, and he's quite happy to have Joseph, who he realizes is so much more talented than he is. And he comes to see Joseph as a son, and Joseph comes to see Montkaw as a father. It's a very touching relationship. And you have, like with the death of Joachim in the Magic Mountain, you have the type of a beautiful death in literature. You know, of course, it's sad to see this man dying on his deathbed with kidney failure, with end-stage kidney disease. But Joseph has allayed his suffering over the course of this slow illness by every night coming to his room and in beautiful, inspired words bidding him good night. People with kidney failure do tend to suffer from insomnia. In some instances, Montkaw suffers from insomnia, and Joseph has been able to soothe him. And he does the same now as Montkaw lies dying. And it's just a beautiful scene without being maudlin or overly sentimental. So that is one of my absolute favorites. So that's it for now. Next time, either tomorrow or in the next few days, we are going to do some freak accident deaths and some sort of more lively and a little on the grotesque sometimes. So we're going to do The Master and Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov, The Trial by Kafka, Darkness at Noon by Arthur Koestler, A Handful of Dust by Evelyn Waugh, and Bleak House by Charles Dickens. So some of you, I'm sure, already know what freak accidents I'm referring to. Not in all of those. In the trial, Joseph K. is actually executed, although in a freakish way. And in Darkness at Noon, also, the death is an execution. But the others are these sort of freak accidents. So we'll talk about that. I hope you'll come back. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.